Homeowners, if you put a home up for sale in 2021, chances are you're going to have multiple offers. And chances are you're going to have multiple offers within a few days. But how do you know which offer is the best offer to work with? Usually when you sell something, it's usually about what puts the most money in your pocket. Although that's extremely important when it comes to real estate, at the end of the day, what's most important is picking an offer that is most likely to succeed. Picking an offer that is most likely going to make it to the settlement table. And in 2021, with all of these new mandates and with COVID still taking a toll on many of us, this is a time where you want to take a look at some things that you may not have really considered in a previous market. So in this video, we're going to go over a few things that any seller should consider when they're reviewing multiple offers and trying to determine which one is the best one for them. But before we get into that, a little bit of house cleaning. I'm Chris Nelson with Gemstone Realty, and this channel is all about real estate advice, tips, and tech. So if any of that excites you, you're in the right place. But do me a favor, drop me a comment, hit that thumbs up, consider subscribing, and mash that bell so that you're notified of my future content. So the first thing you want to consider is the type of financing or lack thereof. Now, most transactions are going to include some type of financing, but the question is, what type of financing and what does that mean to you? Some of the most common loan types you're going to see in this market will be conventional, FHA, or VA. Now, depending where you're at and if USDA financing is an option, you may see USDA as well, but those are a little bit more few and far between because they only apply to rural areas. But if you have to choose from multiple offers and really zero in on which type of financing creates the least amount of turbulence, in my opinion, FHA and VA are very, very similar and will have a little bit more turbulence in a transaction than a conventional loan will. The same thing can be said about USDA, but again, they're a little bit few and far between. Now, when it comes to FHA, VA, and USDA, part of the appraisal process could result in the seller having to do repairs. And generally the way it works is those repairs have to be done prior to closing. And they're things that even if the buyer is willing to overlook and say, I'll do that when I take ownership, it really doesn't matter because the lender isn't going to issue a clear to close until the appraiser goes back out and see that those conditions are met. Now, with conventional, unless the house is falling down, usually these things don't happen. The appraiser goes in and really only determines the value of the home. So if you have to pick between different types of financing, most of the time conventional will be the one that creates the least amount of turbulence and give you, the seller, a few more options when it comes to negotiating the overall transaction with the buyer. The next thing you want to consider are the contingencies. Contingencies are things such as the type of mortgage a buyer might have, the deposits that a buyer is going to give during the transaction, what type of inspections they're going to be doing and how long they're going to request so that those inspections can be done, whether or not they have a home to sell, and whether or not the deal is contingent upon a successful appraisal. All of these contingencies, for the most part, are negotiable. Now, if a buyer needs a mortgage, there's very little you can do as far as countering them to remove that contingency. However, maybe you can negotiate with a buyer if they're strong enough and convince them to go from an FHA or a VA loan to conventional. But the rest of the contingencies, for the most part, are negotiable. And as a seller, this is your opportunity to review them and make sure that they are in your favor. The stronger the deposit you have from the buyer, the better, because they have more sweat equity in the game. The least amount of days they have to do an inspection, or maybe they're waiving the inspection in its entirety, well, ultimately, that puts you in a much better position. The shorter the amount of days, the sooner you know how likely that transaction is to move forward. Or if they're waiving the inspection, well, then guess what? You don't have to worry about anything at all, with the exception of, again, if it's an FHA loan or VA loan, the repairs that may stem from that, or maybe some appraisal issues. But at the end of the day, these are all things that you should be reviewing and making sure that they are in your favor, especially during a seller's market like we're seeing in 2021. Now, speaking of appraisals and inspections, that kind of leads me to my next point. And my next point is whether or not the buyer tried to be creative when it comes to those contingencies. Now, using the inspection and the appraisal specifically, these are things where a buyer may say to you, seller, I am going to do my home inspection because that's my level of comfort. However, I'm going to do it for information purposes only. Therefore, you know that once I do these inspections, I'm either going to move forward or I'm going to terminate, but I'm not going to request any repairs, nor am I going to request any credits. Or you can say to the seller, I'm going to do my home inspection and I'm not going to nitpick. As a matter of fact, I'm going to be responsible for the first X amount of dollars in material defects. That number can range, but ultimately the buyer is telling you, the seller, that I'm going to do my home inspection, and for the first $3,000 worth of things that come up on this inspection report, I'm not going to nitpick. But anything after that, I reserve the right to negotiate with you. So those are some ways that a buyer can get creative. Now, when it comes to an appraisal, they can also get creative only if they have conventional financing or it's a cash transaction, but they wish to have some type of an appraisal contingency. The buyer can get creative and say to you, in the event the property does not appraise, I am willing to pay X amount of dollars over the appraised value. As a matter of fact, I'm seeing this happen quite often, but keep in mind, this is not an option for an FHA, VA, or USDA buyer because the language in the agreement specifically says that the buyer cannot pay more than the appraised value. So keep in mind that this is an option that is only going to apply for someone who has a conventional loan, but it's definitely a way to get creative. I have also seen buyers go out and say that they will take care of the seller's transfer tax. Now, depending where you're at, that could be anywhere from 1 to over 2%. I know in the city of Philadelphia, the transfer tax for one party is 2.14%. So if you sit back and run those numbers, that's a pretty handsome penny and can greatly increase the seller's bottom line. So take a look at the language that the buyers put in the contract and see if there's anything that they've done to be creative so that their offer stands out among the rest. And the last thing, although this applies regardless of the market or whether or not we're going through a pandemic, and that is the strength of the buyer. Now, in a normal market, in my opinion, the strength of the buyer boils down to how much assets do they have and whether or not they have a home that they need to sell in order to purchase the next home. However, in 2021, there's something else that I think buyers should really put a lot of weight on, and that's what type of employment does the buyer have? As we continue to see businesses struggle and shut their doors, you really want to take a look at what type of work the buyer is in. If they're in a field where you think that, well, their job may be questionable, keep in mind that the fact that they're offering you the most amount of money may not have as much weight or may not get you to the settlement table, and maybe the offer that is a little bit less and is cash, or from a buyer that's in some field of work that is protected and or booming. So at the end of the day, when it comes to picking an offer that makes the most sense, it's not always about which one puts the most money in your pocket. Although we all want to make money and the most amount of money when we're selling a home, really the goal is to get the home sold and get it sold successfully with very little turbulence. And if you keep these few points in mind, hopefully they will result in you picking the right offer. So there you have it, folks. There are my tips for the week. And if I can ever be of any value to you, feel free to reach out. As a matter of fact, there's a link below for you to schedule a 15-minute conversation with me so that I can answer any of your questions. And with all of that being said, thanks for tuning in, and check in next week for the very next Just a Tip Tuesday with Chris. Until then, take care.